When Daniel Lawson turned his car into the private road leading up to his mansion, he hadn't planned on being home this early. His business trip had wrapped up ahead of schedule, leaving him with the rare opportunity to surprise his wife and enjoy a quiet evening in the comfort of his own home. But as the sprawling property came into view, something didn't feel right. The driveway gate, usually locked tight with its automated system, stood slightly ajar. The manicured hedges seemed less cared for, as if someone had neglected them for weeks. And the grand front door, solid oak with wrought iron fixtures, was propped open just a crack, swaying in the late summer breeze. Daniel frowned. He always left his home secured, and his housekeeper had been dismissed before his trip. No one was supposed to be here. His stomach tightened with unease as he slowed the car and parked near the steps. That's when he heard it, laughter. Not just any laughter, but a shrill, self-satisfied cackle echoing from inside his own home. A woman's voice, loud and commanding, followed by the sound of heels clicking against the marble floor. Daniel's pulse quickened. He knew that voice, Karen Whitfield, the HOA president, the woman who had made his life miserable ever since he'd moved into this neighborhood 2 years ago. Karen had always been a thorn in his side, complaining about the shade his trees cast on her lawn, finding him for having a delivery truck parked outside for more than 10 minutes, even objecting when he had repainted his shutters a shade darker than the approved HOA palette. She was entitled, smug, and manipulative, everything an HOA president could be if left unchecked. But what was she doing inside his mansion? Daniel stepped cautiously onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under his weight. He pushed the door open wider, the hinges groaning as if protesting the intrusion. What he saw inside left him speechless. The grand foyer, once immaculate with polished marble and neatly arranged vases, was cluttered with shopping bags, piles of shoes, and even a small dog bed. The faint scent of perfume and hairspray filled the air. Family portraits that once hung on the wall had been replaced with generic artwork, cheap landscapes, the kind Karen was known for flaunting at her yard sales. And there, at the foot of the sweeping staircase, stood Karen herself. She wore a silk robe that was clearly not hers, his late wife's robe, still neatly folded in the closet the last time he'd seen it. A wine glass dangled from her hand, half filled with an expensive vintage he had been saving for a special occasion. Her hair was pinned up carelessly, and she smiled at him as if he were the intruder. "Well, look who decided to show up," she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I thought you were supposed to be gone for another 2 weeks." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Karen, what are you doing here? Why are you in my house?" She laughed again, the sound echoing off the marble. "Your house? Oh, Daniel, you've got it all wrong. The HOA has been very concerned about this property being vacant. It was practically begging for someone responsible to step in and take care of it. So I moved in. I've been keeping things in order." His eyes swept the foyer again. Boxes, clothes, even kitchen appliances had been rearranged. This wasn't keeping things in order. This was moving in. She had made herself comfortable. "You broke into my home," Daniel said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Karen tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Broke in? No, Daniel. The front door was unlocked. I simply occupied what the HOA had deemed neglected. Honestly, you should thank me. Do you know how bad it looks to have a mansion sitting empty in our community?" Daniel took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Get out now." But Karen only smirked. "You don't get to order me around in my neighborhood. You think owning a mansion gives you special rights. It doesn't. The HOA has more authority than you realize, and if you try to throw me out, well." She pulled a phone from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the screen. "I'll just call 911 and let the police decide who really belongs here." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Karen, the woman who had spent years tormenting him with fines and citations, was now squatting in his mansion and threatening to call the police on him. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Karen dialed the number. "Hello, yes," she said, her voice suddenly turning shrill and panicked, as though she were rehearsing for a stage play. "There's a strange man in my house. He's trying to threaten me. Please send someone quickly." Daniel froze, his fists clenching at his sides. She wasn't just squatting, she was setting him up. And as the faint sound of a dispatcher's voice came through Karen's phone, Daniel realized one chilling truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a trap. But Daniel had no idea that when the police arrived, the situation would take a turn so shocking that even the entire neighborhood would be left speechless. Karen just called 911 on the actual homeowner, and she's not stopping there. If you want to see how this unbelievable HOA showdown unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss what happens next. Blue and red lights flashed against the mansion's tall windows, casting streaks across the marble floor. Within minutes of Karen's frantic 911 call, 2 police cruisers pulled into the driveway, their sirens silenced but their presence commanding. Daniel stood frozen in the foyer, arms crossed. Every muscle in his body tense. He knew how this would look. A well-dressed woman in a silk robe claiming to be the rightful occupant, and a man returning unexpectedly with no one to back up his word. He clenched his jaw, reminding himself to remain calm. Karen, of course, played the part to perfection. As the first officer approached the front door, she rushed forward with tears glistening in her eyes. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she cried, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. "This man broke into my home. He's threatening me. I don't feel safe." Daniel opened his mouth, but the officer held up a hand, signaling him to stay quiet. "Ma'am, step outside with us for a moment," the taller of the 2 officers said, guiding Karen gently toward the porch. She sniffled dramatically, clutching the robe around her shoulders as though she were a fragile victim. The second officer turned his attention to Daniel. "Sir, can I see some identification, please?" Daniel pulled out his wallet, his hands steady despite the frustration boiling inside him. "My name is Daniel Lawson. This is my home. I just got back early from a business trip, and I found her living here." The officer studied the driver's license, glancing back at the man before him. "Do you have proof of ownership?" "Deeds, mail, anything with your name and this address on it." Daniel nodded toward the study down the hall. "Yes, I keep important documents in my safe. I can show you right now." But before he could move, Karen's voice cut through the night like a blade. "He's lying." She shouted from the porch. "I've been living here for weeks. The HOA approved me to take care of this house since it was abandoned. He's trying to scam his way in." The officer glanced between them, his brow furrowed. "All right. Both of you, calm down. We'll figure this out." Karen pressed forward, her eyes flashing with indignation. "No, you don't understand. He's dangerous. Look at him. He barged in without permission. If you don't remove him right now, I'll file charges." Daniel took a slow breath, willing himself not to explode. Losing his temper would only feed her narrative. Instead, he spoke evenly. "Officer, this is absurd. I can prove I own this property. If you'll just come with me to the study." The officer hesitated, then gestured for Daniel to lead the way. Karen tried to protest, but the taller officer held her back. "Ma'am, let him show us the documents." They entered the study, where Daniel quickly spun the dial on a built-in safe. Inside were neatly stacked folders, including property deeds, tax records, and utility bills, all bearing his name and the mansion's address. He handed them over. The officer flipped through the papers, nodding slightly. "This looks legitimate." But before relief could wash over Daniel, the taller officer entered the room again, holding something in his hand, a printed letter on HOA letterhead. "Sir," the officer said cautiously, "she claims the HOA authorized her to live here temporarily to maintain the property. Do you know anything about this?" Daniel's stomach dropped. He snatched the letter, scanning it quickly. It was dated 2 weeks ago and bore what appeared to be the HOA official seal, signed by none other than Karen herself as president. The letter stated that the HOA had voted to allow her to occupy the vacant property in the community's best interest. "This is nonsense," Daniel said, his voice tightening. "The HOA doesn't have the authority to let someone move into a privately owned home. This signature is hers. She wrote this herself." Karen stepped back inside, her expression shifting from faux fear to smug triumph. "The HOA protects this neighborhood, Daniel, and we all agreed that a vacant mansion was an eyesore. I stepped up, like a good neighbor. These officers can see I've been living here responsibly." The shorter officer frowned. "Ma'am, this doesn't look right. This is his legal deed, and these are tax documents." Karen's lips curled into a sly smile. "Deeds can be outdated. And besides, ask the neighbors. They've seen me here for weeks. Who do you think they'll believe? The woman who's been active in the community for years, or the man who abandoned his property?" Daniel's hands tightened into fists at his sides. She wasn't just squatting. She had orchestrated this, weaving a net of lies with the HOA letterhead as her weapon. The taller officer sighed, clearly torn. "We'll need to call this in. Until then, nobody's going anywhere. Sir, we need you to wait outside." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. His home, his sanctuary, had become a stage for Karen's performance, and now the law itself seemed tangled in her web. As the officers stepped aside to make their calls, Daniel knew he had to prepare himself. Karen wasn't going to leave quietly. She had the neighbors, the HOA letterhead, and even the police hesitating. But what none of them knew was that Daniel had a piece of evidence locked away, something Karen had overlooked, something that could turn the entire situation upside down, and when Daniel revealed it, the truth would leave everyone, Karen, the police, and the entire HOA, absolutely stunned. The night air outside the mansion felt heavy, thick with tension as Daniel stood on the porch, arms crossed. The police officers paced, speaking into their radios, while Karen leaned casually against the railing, sipping the last of her wine. Her act of a terrified victim had melted away, replaced by the smug satisfaction of someone convinced she had already won. "You should just give up, Daniel," she whispered smugly, loud enough for him to hear. "The HOA backs me. The neighbors know me. The police see me living here. Face it. You don't belong anymore." Daniel didn't flinch. His silence unnerved her more than any argument could, because deep down he knew something she didn't, something he had kept hidden for years. Inside, the taller officer was still on the phone with dispatch, explaining the conflicting documents, one a legally binding deed, the other a letter signed under HOA authority. The dispatcher promised to send a supervisor to help sort it out. Daniel exhaled slowly, then turned to the shorter officer. "I need to show you something. It's in my basement safe. It will clear this up." Karen's smugness faltered for the briefest moment. "Basement safe," she repeated, her tone sharp. "He's probably making this up. You don't have to waste your time entertaining his lies." The officer ignored her and gestured for Daniel to lead the way. They entered the mansion again, passing through the clutter Karen had scattered across the floors. Her perfume still lingered in the air, tainting the familiar scent of his home. Every step fueled his determination. Down in the basement, Daniel knelt before a second safe built discreetly into the wall. He had installed it years ago after a break-in scare in the neighborhood. Unlike the upstairs safe, which held paperwork, this one protected his most valuable and irrefutable evidence: digital backups, security recordings, and property records no HOA letter could dispute. With a few precise turns of the dial, the lock clicked open. Daniel pulled out a sleek black case and set it on the workbench. Inside were several external hard drives and a folder marked Property Surveillance. "This," Daniel said firmly, handing the folder to the officer, "contains footage from my security system. Every corner of this property is under surveillance, inside and out. It automatically backs up to these drives. You'll see exactly when Karen entered my house and how long she's been here." The officer flipped open the folder, pulling out still shots, grainy black, and white images of Karen hauling suitcases through the front door 2 weeks ago, using what appeared to be a crowbar to pry the lock. Another still showed her dragging in shopping bags, rearranging furniture, and even moving one of Daniel's antique paintings into the garage. Karen's face drained of color. Those could be doctored. She snapped, her voice shrill. He probably faked those images just to frame me. But Daniel was ready. He tapped the hard drive. This contains time-stamped video, unaltered, backed up on multiple devices. You can even compare it to the security company's cloud server. I gave them authorization years ago to store everything offsite for protection. The officer's eyes narrowed as he studied the evidence. If what you're saying checks out, then this changes everything. Karen lunged forward, her voice climbing higher with desperation. Don't you see? He's trying to manipulate you. This house was abandoned. I was protecting it. The HOA gave me permission. Daniel straightened, his voice steady but cold. Permission doesn't override ownership. You broke in. You stole. You've been living in my house, drinking my wine, wearing my late wife's robe. His words cut sharper than steel. For a moment, silence filled the basement. The officer's radio crackled, summoning him upstairs to speak with the arriving supervisor. He motioned for Daniel to follow. When they emerged into the foyer, a new patrol car had joined the others. A stern-looking sergeant stepped inside, his eyes scanning the scene with practiced scrutiny. "What do we have here?" he asked. The taller officer quickly explained, conflicting documents, possible squatting, and now the revelation of surveillance footage. The sergeant turned his gaze on Karen. "Ma'am, did you break into this property?" Karen clasped her hands together, feigning outrage. "Absolutely not. I entered with authorization, the HOA letter, which you signed yourself." Daniel interrupted, holding up the paper. "You forged authority that doesn't exist." The sergeant took the paper, examining it closely. His brow furrowed. "This doesn't look like an official HOA resolution. It's a single signature." Karen's composure began to crack. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around the room. "The board." "The board approved it verbally. I just documented it." The sergeant's expression hardened. "That's not how this works." Daniel saw his opening. He set the folder on the table, sliding the still images toward the sergeant. "These are from my security system. They show her breaking in. If you'd like, I'll hand over the hard drive to verify." Karen's face twisted with fury. "This is harassment. He abandoned his house, and I stepped in to keep it from falling apart. I'm the victim here." But her voice lacked the confidence it once carried. The neighbors, drawn by the flashing lights, were beginning to gather at the edge of the driveway. Whispers filled the night air, curious, judgmental, shocked. Daniel felt the tide beginning to turn, but he knew better than to celebrate yet. Karen had a way of twisting even the most damning evidence into a story that favored her. She wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The sergeant held up a hand. "We'll need to review everything before making a decision." "No one leaves until this is sorted." Karen smirked faintly, regaining a sliver of confidence. "That's fine, because once the HOA board hears about this, they'll back me, and when they do, you'll all see who really belongs in this mansion." Daniel's stomach tightened. If Karen truly had the HOA board wrapped around her finger, then even the strongest evidence might not be enough, and what the sergeant said next made the crowd outside gasp in disbelief. The sergeant's gaze swept across the foyer, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Until we sort this out, this property is officially under dispute. Nobody enters or removes anything without clearance." The words rippled through the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered outside. Gasps, murmurs, and hushed whispers filled the night. Daniel's jaw clenched. His home, his sanctuary, was now being treated like a crime scene, thanks to Karen's lies. Karen, however, seized the moment. She squared her shoulders and raised her chin, addressing the sergeant with exaggerated calm. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate you treating this with the seriousness it deserves. The HOA board has always trusted me to act in the community's best interest." They'll support me in this matter. In fact, I've already notified them." Almost on cue, headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. A sleek SUV and two sedans pulled up behind the police cruisers. Out stepped three well-dressed individuals, HOA board members. Daniel recognized them immediately. Patricia, the vice president, with her sharp suits and sharp opinions, Leonard, the treasurer, a man whose calculating gaze always hinted at hidden motives, and Janet, the secretary, a quiet but loyal ally to Karen. The crowd parted as the trio strode toward the mansion with the air of officials arriving at a town hall meeting. Patricia spoke first, her voice carrying authority. "Officers, thank you for responding. We're here to clarify the situation. Karen has been acting under the board's guidance. This property was left vacant, and we feared it would deteriorate. The board agreed she could temporarily occupy it to ensure proper upkeep." Daniel's chest tightened. "That's a lie. You can't authorize someone to move into a private home. This is my property. Look at the deed." Leonard adjusted his glasses, glancing dismissively at the documents on the table. "Deeds are important, yes, but so is the community's welfare. When a mansion sits empty, it lowers property values. The HOA has broad authority to intervene when a home is neglected." Neglected? Daniel's voice sharpened, though he kept his composure. "I was gone for a 2-week business trip. That's hardly abandonment. You all knew my schedule. I even informed the HOA office." Karen stepped forward, her expression one of theatrical innocence. "We didn't know when you'd be back, Daniel, and frankly, 2 weeks without maintenance for a property of this size can cause issues. The board supported me in protecting the neighborhood." The sergeant studied the group, his frown deepening. "I need to make this clear. HOA rules don't override property ownership. Unless there's a legal transfer, this house belongs to Mr. Lawson." Patricia crossed her arms. "And we respect that, officer, but surely you can see Daniel has left the property vulnerable. Karen took initiative and the board stands by her decision. If anything, Mr. Lawson should be grateful." The neighbors outside murmured louder now, some shaking their heads, others whispering in Karen's defense. The crowd was split, half siding with Daniel's right to his home, half convinced Karen's narrative held merit. Daniel felt the weight of eyes on him. He realized Karen wasn't just manipulating the police. She was using the community itself as her shield. And if the HOA board continued to back her, his fight wouldn't just be about reclaiming his house. It would be about clearing his name in front of everyone. The sergeant looked between the deed in his hand and the smug board. "Members, we're not here to referee HOA disputes. We're here to uphold the law. Unless you can show me legal documentation transferring ownership, this house is Daniel Lawson's." Karen's smirk faltered, but Patricia quickly interjected. "There's more to it, Sergeant. We filed a notice with the county registrar marking the property as under HOA review. It's pending verification." Daniel's eyes widened. "You what?" Leonard spoke smoothly, almost as if rehearsed. "It's a common procedure, Daniel. When a property risks becoming a blight, the HOA can file a temporary notice. It's not a transfer of ownership, it's a precaution." The sergeant's face hardened. "I'll need to see that filing, right now." Karen's lips curved into a smile once more. "Gladly, I have copies in my car." She glided toward the driveway, every step radiating confidence. Daniel's fists clenched. He knew what she was bringing back wasn't a legitimate filing. It would be another fabrication, just like the letter she'd waved earlier. But would the officers, the neighbors, or even the county clerk see through it? As Karen rummaged through her SUV, the murmurs outside grew louder. Some neighbors shouted encouragement to her, praising her dedication to the community. Others called out Daniel's name, telling him to fight for his rights. The tension had turned the mansion into the center of neighborhood spectacle. Karen finally returned, holding a thick envelope. She handed it to the sergeant with a triumphant smile. "Here it is. Official documentation. See for yourself." The sergeant opened the envelope, scanning the forms inside, his brow furrowed, his lips tightening. The papers bore county seals, signatures, and stamped dates. To the untrained eye, they looked official. Daniel's heart sank. He had never filed anything like this, and he knew the HOA had no legal right to do so, but how could he prove it standing here with half the neighborhood already convinced of Karen's righteousness? The sergeant looked up, his expression unreadable, and said words that made the entire crowd gasp, words that could mean Daniel was about to lose everything he had fought for. The next morning, Michael received an official letter slipped under his door. The HOA board had scheduled an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. The letter was short, stiff, and carried a tone that dripped with arrogance. Attendance mandatory. Your non-compliance with community guidelines has raised concerns that must be addressed. Michael couldn't help but laugh. Non-compliance. He had just returned to his own mansion after a trip, only to find Karen squatting there for 2 weeks, and now he was being accused of violating rules. Still, he knew he had to show up. If nothing else, he wanted the entire neighborhood to hear the truth in one room. When he arrived at the HOA clubhouse, the room was already buzzing. Residents whispered in corners, clearly intrigued by the growing feud. At the head of the long oak table sat Karen, dressed as though she were presiding over a courtroom, her pearls glinting under the chandelier light. Beside her sat 2 board members, both with expressions that suggested they had already chosen sides. Michael, Karen greeted, her voice syrupy but sharp underneath. "We're glad you could join us. Let's address your issues." "My issues," Michael replied calmly, settling into his chair. "You mean the part where you broke into my home and lived there for 2 weeks?" A ripple of gasps traveled through the room. Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. She slid a stack of papers across the table. "Actually," she countered, "this is about your violation of HOA standards. Leaving a property unoccupied for more than a week without informing the board. It's in our bylaws, and when I noticed suspicious activity, which turned out to be your absence, I took temporary residence to protect the community's interest." The audacity of her words sent a murmur through the crowd. Protect the community. She had been throwing parties in his mansion and pretending it was hers. Michael's patience was wearing thin. "Let's be clear," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "You weren't protecting the community. You were trespassing, and you called 911 on me when I returned to my own home. If you want to talk about violations, let's talk about that." Karen's mask cracked. She slammed her palm on the table. "How dare you twist the truth?" She snapped. "I acted in good faith, and the HOA will not tolerate your disruptive attitude." But before Michael could respond, one of the quieter board members spoke up. An older woman named Mrs. Carter, who had lived in the community for decades, cleared her throat. "Karen," she said slowly, "are you admitting that you entered his property without permission?" The room went silent. Karen stammered, her composure faltering. "Well, I was ensuring safety. That's what any responsible neighbor would do." Michael seized the moment. "No, Karen, a responsible neighbor would have called me, or the property manager. You, on the other hand, made yourself comfortable in my living room." The tension in the room was suffocating. Residents exchanged looks, some clearly questioning everything they thought they knew about Karen. For the first time, the tide was shifting, but Karen wasn't about to surrender her control. She suddenly leaned forward, eyes glinting. "Fine," she spat. "If you want to play this game, then let's talk about what I found in your garage. You wouldn't want the community to know, would you?" Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Michael's jaw tightened. The garage, the one she had no business entering, was about to become the next battleground, and what she was about to reveal could turn the entire HOA meeting upside down. But the words Karen spoke next about Michael's garage would shatter the room's fragile silence and put his reputation on the line. The quiet of the courtroom was shattered when the HOA attorney dramatically slammed a stack of papers onto the table. His voice was sharp, cold, and brimming with arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are about to see." He said, looking straight at the judge, is proof that our HOA had every right to act. The homeowner, Mr. Thompson, abandoned his property, and my client, Mrs. Karen, took necessary steps to maintain it. Karen, sitting smugly beside him in a perfectly pressed blazer, gave a little nod. Her eyes darted toward the audience, searching for validation. She believed this was her moment, that the courtroom would applaud her for her civic duty. But David, calm, collected, and holding his ground, leaned forward with his attorney at his side. He didn't flinch, he didn't even blink. Instead, he watched as the attorney spread the documents across the judge's bench like playing cards. These, the attorney declared, are copies of letters sent to Mr. Thompson notifying him that his property was falling into violation of HOA standards. He ignored them. He left the property vacant, and Mrs. Karen had no choice but to move in temporarily to prevent further damage. The crowd stirred. Murmurs swept across the room. The boldness of the claim was shocking. Karen had twisted the story so far that she wasn't just defending herself. She was painting herself as the hero. David's lawyer stood. Calmly, with measured words, he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, may I?" The judge gave a curt nod. He walked to the table, picked up one of the letters, and held it high for all to see. "Interesting thing about these letters," he said, pacing the courtroom floor. "They're dated during the exact 2 weeks Mr. Thompson was overseas on a business trip. That would be normal, if not for one glaring fact." He stopped, turned, and slammed the letter down. These letters were never mailed. They were typed, printed, and backdated, and we have proof. The air thickened, all eyes turned toward Karen. Her confident smirk flickered just for a moment. David's lawyer continued, pulling out his own evidence. "Here are the postal records for Mr. Thompson's address. Not one of these letters was ever processed or delivered. They were fabricated, a paper trail made to justify an illegal takeover of private property." Gasps filled the room. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, leaning forward with sudden interest. Karen's attorney quickly objected. "Speculation. This is baseless." But David's lawyer cut him off smoothly. "Baseless? Then perhaps you can explain why Mrs. Karen was found inside Mr. Thompson's home, sleeping in his bed, wearing his robe, and—" He paused for effect, his eyes narrowing, "using his credit card to order furniture deliveries to the mansion. Deliveries made the very week he was gone." The audience erupted. The bailiff had to call for order. Karen's face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She looked around the room desperately, but every pair of eyes was locked on her. The image she had so carefully built, the dutiful HOA warrior, the protector of the neighborhood, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. David, for the first time since this ordeal began, allowed himself a small smile. He leaned back in his chair, his composure steady, as if he had known this moment would come. The judge banged the gavel, silencing the chaos. "Order, order," his voice echoed. "If what you say is true, counselor, then this is not only a matter of civil dispute. This borders on criminal behavior." Karen's attorney paled. "Your Honor, surely." But before he could finish, the judge lifted a hand. "Enough! I want to see every piece of evidence, every record, every document, and if these claims hold." He let the sentence hang heavy in the air. "Then Mrs. Karen will not be leaving this courtroom as a free woman." Karen's breath hitched. Her hands trembled, the color drained from her face. For the first time, she seemed to understand the weight of what was crashing down upon her, and yet there was something unsettling, something David couldn't quite put his finger on. Because just as Karen sat there, unraveling under the weight of truth, she leaned toward her attorney and whispered something. Something sharp, fast, and venomous. He stiffened, his jaw tightened. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because Karen still had a secret, and when she revealed it, the courtroom would freeze in utter disbelief. The day of the hearing arrived, and the small town courthouse brimmed with whispers. Neighbors, HOA members, Even a few curious strangers filled the benches. Everyone wanted to see the showdown between Karen and the rightful homeowner. Karen entered first, chin lifted, dressed in her usual dramatic flair, as though she were walking onto a stage. She gave the crowd a smug smile, convinced the system would bend to her will, but the quiet determination on the homeowner's face painted a different story. The judge called the case, and Karen launched into a speech as if she were auditioning for a play. She claimed she had been wronged, insisting the mansion was abandoned and that she had merely protected it. Her words were laced with self-pity, her tone dripping with entitlement. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads, others exchanging disbelieving glances. Then the homeowner's attorney stood, calm, collected, and armed with evidence. He began dismantling Karen's story piece by piece. He presented the deed to the property, security camera footage showing her moving in without permission, and the outrageous HOA complaint letters she had filed against the actual owner. Gasps filled the room as each document was displayed, the truth cutting through Karen's carefully spun lies. Karen's expression began to crumble. Her confidence melted into panic, and her voice wavered as she tried to object, but the judge's gavel silenced her. The homeowner remained composed, his presence a stark contrast to Karen's unraveling performance. When the verdict came, it was swift and clear. The mansion rightfully belonged to its owner, and Karen faced severe consequences for her deception. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, half in relief, half in disbelief. Some neighbors even applauded quietly, their frustration with Karen's antics finally finding resolution. Karen, red, faced and trembling, stormed out of the courtroom, her reign of chaos over. The homeowner walked out into the sunlight, greeted by supportive nods and kind words from neighbors who had once been swayed by Karen's drama. For the first time in weeks, the mansion felt like his again, not just in name, but in spirit. But just as peace settled over the neighborhood, whispers began circulating, whispers that Karen wasn't done yet, that she was already scheming her next move. And the homeowner knew one thing for certain: with Karen, the story was never truly over. But what Karen did in the weeks that followed would leave even the judge stunned.